Hey, welcome to Live from Dennis's house. Today we have a special show for you. We're throwing the script away from what we normally do, a whole different format. We're doing the rise and fall of music. We're going to give you the history of music, how it came to be, not all of music, mostly rock and roll, and then we're going to tell you about the fall, the decline, which we're in right now. And my guest, of course, you know, Mike Padron, the lead singer of Light My Fire, and a special guest, esteemed colleague, the Professor Luther B. Hayes. He's got a PhD in rock and roll, MBA in the blues. He's an adjunct professor of Indigenous Studies at Spelman College, and he wrote the book, I'm Okay, You Suck. And he's here today to help us go through the history of music. So we're going to get right to it. Normally we would play some songs, right, Mike? You're probably thinking we're going to play some songs, but we got so much to cover. When I'm, and I had a whole rant of current events that I was going to freak out about, but I'm bypassing that because we got to get to the entire history of music because we're going to start from the beginning. Now, music, there was absolutely no music for the first 1700 years of civilization. There was classical music in Europe, and that was it. And nobody cares about classical music, so we're not going to talk about classical music. We're going to jump right over that, and we're going to go to the 1920s, United States. We had country music down in the South, and we had gospel music. Now, gospel music was a huge influence on rock and roll. You speak to any singer, and they always say, oh, yeah, I grew up in the church singing gospel music. That's how Elvis started, gospel music in the church, and everybody. And so it brings up a question here, because gospel music first came to the States from slaves who were brought over, and they used to sing it in the field picking cotton, and then it transferred over into the church. So, Mike, I'm going to ask this question to you. Mm-hmm. If there was no slavery, there would be no rock and roll. So if you had your choice, slavery or rock and roll?
No slavery, rock and roll. What kind of a question is that?
Well, that's the dilemma. If you could go back in time and say, all right, there's not going to be any slavery, then we wouldn't have rock and roll right now. We'd be listening to Justin Bieber, which we're listening to anyway. So, but we would never have rock and roll. You see where I'm going with this?
We would still have music, though. Everyone would be happy living together, and there'd be none of that crap.
No, there would be no good music, though. Yeah. I'm sticking with that because
right.
One of the other building blocks of rock and roll, of course, is the blues. Which also came from slavery and made its way into the United States. People were blue, so they started singing about that. And then our other form, it was jazz, of course. Now, all these forms of music were created by black people, and without slavery, we wouldn't have never had. Now, it sounds like I'm pro-slavery, but I'm definitely not. We can't even joke about something like that. No. But I'm just saying that, there's a lot of correlation between all this stuff. So you had the jazz that was in New Orleans, Kansas City, and of course up in Harlem. And then, of course, you had folk music, which came out of Oklahoma with people like Woody Guthrie. And then it all came together in the 1950s. That you had stuff like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf down in Chicago on Chess Records, right? And then you had the explosion of rock and roll, the birth of rock and roll. It started with Sam Phillips at Sun Records, where he had Elvis, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee all in the same little studio. And then, of course, it just exploded. You had all these people, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, rockabilly. You had Bill Haley, Chuck Berry, of course, who... John Lennon, do you know what John Lennon said about Chuck Berry?
Do not.
Luther?
No, I do not.
John Lennon said, if you didn't call it rock and roll, you should have called it Chuck Berry. That's how much Chuck Berry meant to rock and roll, that he could have just called it Chuck Berry. And then you had Little Richard, Fats Domino, and rockabilly. You had Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran. Then you had Buddy Holly, Bo Diddley. And it was just so much music at this time. And the kids went wild for it. All right? So you guys can interject anytime you want. If I'm missing something, if I'm leaving something out, if I'm giving fake facts, fake news, if you will.
Not at all. The jukebox, man. The jukebox.
What about the jukebox?
It was instrumental music. Gave people choice. Instead of having to listen to the radio, put on whatever you want and go to the jukebox. Birth. Right there.
There you go.
Brought music to you.
Nice.
From there, FM radio.
Well, you didn't. Well, was this back in the 50s? Did we have FM? I don't think we had FM back then. It was
Well,
only AM.
you had AM.
Right.
And from there, went right into the FM radio.
Hey, you're jumping ahead. You can't jump ahead on my show. We go in chronological order here. So let's stop at AM for a minute. And, we're going to talk about DJs and stuff like that in a second. But the one thing that leads up to the downfall of music is that the man was always against rock and roll. That he called it race music, and they didn't want their white kids messing around with the black kids and the races mixing, so they tried to shut it down. But of course, it was too good. You can't shut something like this down. But you know what they tried to do? They tried the worst thing that they ever did. It might even be worse than slavery. They put Pat Boone on us. That they took all these great songs by like Little Richard and the Black Artists, which had so much soul and feeling, and they said, all right, let's have Pat Boone record these songs, and then we can let the white kids listen to it, because it won't be, there won't be any sex involved. It'll be vanilla and white bread, and it won't hurt anybody. And it turned out some of the worst music ever recorded. Would you agree with that, Luther?
I agree. That was terrible. Dark days, dark ages.
So, so of course he had all this music, and of course the man, his main goal was to shut it all down, which by the end of the 50s he did with the payola scandal. You remember this payola scandal?
Yeah.
That was, you want to talk about payola?
Pay to play.
Exactly.
Just killing us.
Paying the DJs. That's what they used to do. They used to give the DJs at the radio stations money to play their albums, records. And there was a big scandal, and it, So, all right, here, I got a good question for you, though. Who coined the phrase rock and roll?
Ooh.
It was a DJ.
Alan Freed.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, man.
And that's why the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is in Cleveland, because nobody knows where Cleveland really even is. But he started DJing in Cleveland, so that's why they put the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame
there. They got great
there.
steamers in Cleveland.
Luther.
Yeah. So then by the end of the 50s, everything came crashing down once again. That the man, he put Chuck Berry in jail for transporting young white girls across state lines, which is frowned upon. If you don't know about that, Mike Padron, it's frowned upon. And then Jerry Lee Lewis was blacklisted for marrying his 13-year-old cousin, which is also frowned upon. And then Buddy Holly, of course, died in a plane crash. And with Big Bopper. And then Elvis was in the army, and it's just there was nothing left. And they replaced them with, once again, vanilla white bread singers like Fabian and Frankie Valli and whatever that nonsense was. And that was the end of the era there. So would you like to interject anything? At
Bob
this point?
Dylan.
We're not certainly not up to Bob Dylan. We're at the end of 1959 right here.
Okay.
I'm going in chronological order here. After the break, we're going to come back and we're going to do all about the 60s. So, got anything to interject about the 50s, Mike? Or
Frank
did I
Sinatra
leave anything else?
wasn't-
Oh, yes, that was a very good point. See, there you go.
Making movies.
You had that music that we didn't even talk about. World War II, you had swing music, big band music, and, of course, Frank Sinatra.
Bobby Darin.
And, all of these guys were rock stars of their time. What was cooler than the Rat Pack? That was rock stars. And those jazz musicians in Harlem in the 20s, that was rock stars. They're all on drugs. And the man ran them out of town, killed them all. Don't mess with the man, Mike. No, he will kill you and run you out of the business so fast you won't know what hit you. So, so that's it. So we're going to take a break now. We're going to play some instrumental songs of this time, and then we're going to come back, and we're going to start with the 60s. So let's play, how about Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry and Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley, and we'll be right back. Live from Dennis's house, 474 The Mix. Hey, welcome back, live from Dennis's house. That was Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry, or Rock and Roll, as he's known to his friends, and Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley, which was, of course, the theme song to what television show in the 70s? Luther.
Happy Days.
Very good. Luther is cleaning up here on the trivia. So, all right, so now we're going to start with the 60s. And there was some stuff going on in the early 60s, as Luther mentioned on the break. Of course, there was the folk scene, but I'm not getting into that right now. We're going to start right at the Beatles, where it all began, where the current rock music really was the starting ground for this. So early 60s, Beatles starting, but they hit United States 1964. It was the biggest thing to ever happen to the world, I would say, to the country, that the Beatles took our music that we exported to them. They took the blues, they took Chuck Berry, they took Buddy Holly, all of this music that they loved. They ate it all up in England, and then they, rehashed it back out, and they performed some of the greatest music ever recorded. So, of course, along with the Beatles in '64, you had the Stones and the whole British invasion thing going on here. But the Beatles and the Stones, of course, were the preeminent bands of that era from England.
Now, the Beatles were a huge fan of Elvis Presley.
Oh, of course.
And Little Richard.
Yes. All of those guys.
Long Tall Sally was the original. Who wrote the original for that?
Long Tall Sally? It was Little Richard.
Little Richard, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And Paul McCartney used to sing that all the time in the cavern, and just
yes.
That really was
the Beatles took off and playing in the cavern. At first, they started in Berlin, and then they made it here. So we'll just keep moving through the '60s, and of course, there was a phenomenon, Beatlemania. Everybody was ripping their hair out. Girls were crying, screaming. They were the first not really the first, but in the 60s, they were the first teeny boppers. You had all the way back from Elvis and Frank Sinatra, they had teeny boppers. So girls were always crazy. I'm thinking that's fair to say, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Love
absolutely.
it, though.
Yes, and that's the thing about rock and roll too, that it comes from the crotch, as I've heard people say before. That other music comes from the head, the heart, the soul, whatever. Rock and roll comes from the crotch, and that's why it's so dangerous, and that's why parents are afraid of it, and that's why kids love it.
Especially if you're wearing leather pants on
Exactly.
Elvis was a real big promoter of that, too.
Yes, of course. Let's go back, like you said. Interject. We'll go back anything we missed. And Elvis, of course, when he was on Ed Sullivan's show, and he started swiveling his hips, they had to cut and come up to his waist. Up to his chest, so you couldn't see his waist because it was so provocative.
Film from the chest up, yeah.
And there was Pat Boone. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, So, but you're not fooling us. So anyway, we're in the mid '60s here. Beatlemania is going strong, and of course, Bob Dylan. One of the most monumental events of the '60s is Bob Dylan goes electric. In what year, Chuck?
1965.
Very good.
Wow.
All right,
Ding,
Chuck
ding, ding,
is
ding.
good. He knows, at the Newport Jazz Festival, I believe it was.
And what guitar was Bob Dylan playing?
Oh, I don't know that
Was it
one.
a Telly?
It was a Stratocaster, Fender, American. Yes.
Nice.
I believe
Did
so.
not go
Black
over
and
big.
white.
Oh.
And in the backstage, there was somebody trying to cut the wires with an axe. What is his name?
That was Pat Boone.
No. Oh, geez, he was a very, very Pete Seeger.
Really?
Seeger.
He was trying to cut that?
He was like, "What is this garbage? This is a folk festival." And
Wow.
Bob Dylan is just,
I love Pete
playing,
Seeger. Yeah, I know.
playing electric. Yeah, I saw Bob Dylan's documentary.
I'm going to have to turn my back on Pete Seeger if that's what he did.
He attempted to cut the wires while Bob was on
Wow.
stage. Watch the documentary.
All right. Yeah, I'm going to have to check that out. So,
Bob Dylan's definitely one of my favorite lyricists of all time.
Of course. And that's
His
why.
lyrics influenced a lot of
best.
people.
And that's what happened, that right after he went, actually right before he went electric, he had a monumental meeting with the Beatles at some hotel in New York City, right? And he turned them on to weed for the first time.
Marijuana.
Exactly. And they both influenced each other.
Luther.
That Bob Dylan talking to the Beatles said, you can write any lyrics you want to write. You don't have to just sing, I love her, she loves me, boy, girl stuff. You can write anything.
Yeah,
and
if you're not wasted, today is.
And then the Beatles told Bob Dylan, well, you can play rock and roll music. So that was historic, that Bob Dylan went electric and the Beatles started writing, more mature adult lyrics. And they got turned on to drugs. And the whole world blew up. And the whole world went crazy in 1967. Oh, it was just...
Well, there was a lot of stuff going on in '67. The war and
the Cream,
Black and Whites and
Jimi Hendrix.
Rioting.
Did you know that Bob Dylan and Joan Baez played at Martin Luther King's big speech? They played at the podium.
Oh,
before
really?
they
At the
went on?
Washington March?
they
Yeah,
did.
yeah. All
They
this
sure
stuff
did.
going on. The turbulent 60s, the most crazy decade besides this one, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and of course, also during this time, like from Detroit, you had Motown. Motown coming in, and you had Phil Spector, the Wall of Sound, the great Phil Spector.
James Brown.
Right, James Brown.
Hardest working man in show.
Yes, exactly.
Get on the good foot.
And then, of course, 1967, Summer of Love took place in San Francisco, was the heart of this. You had bands like...
Haight-Ashbury.
Yes, Haight-Ashbury. Bands like who? Name some bands.
The Grateful Dead.
Grateful Dead.
The Doors.
The Doors.
Well, the Doors, yes, were during this time, but they were stationed in L.A. And then you had the Dead,
Jefferson
of
Mamas
course.
and the Papas.
Janis
Yeah.
Joplin, right?
Jefferson
All these
Airplane.
times.
Yes.
Right. So, and there was kind of a feud going on. They didn't really like each other. L.A. and San Francisco scene didn't like each other. So,
Well, Luther's from California. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
There you go, fans.
Santa Monica.
Santa Monica. And he actually grew up right near Lenny Kravitz.
Oh, really?
And knew Lenny Kravitz when he was young.
Met him when he was young.
Oh, wow. And his mom,
Roxy
Roca from the
how
Jeffersons.
That's actually how we knew him.
Well, Lenny Roca, or what was it?
No. His father. He's always been Kravitz,
Oh, okay.
but
happened to your voice,
his mother was Roxy Roker, and at the time it was the '70s, and she was a famous television star on the show The Jeffersons.
Right.
So yeah, that's. I remember, when I had first met him, a friend of mine introduced me to him and stuff, and we had gone over, and he was already into music. He was playing the guitar and playing the drums and stuff. And
Wasn't there a music teacher you were saying?
no, he actually had studied at a school in Santa Monica or whatever. And long story short, that's how we had met him, but no one knew then that he would be. Lenny Kravitz. We just he was Roxy Roker's boy.
Wow.
That's
you
pretty
go.
funny. Yeah, a small world. So, yeah, I think you can call him. I'd like to have him on the show next month.
Yeah,
Get back to me on
probably.
that.
Yeah, no, wouldn't. Haven't spoken to him in 25 years.
Since the Green Parrot.
Oh, the Green Parrot. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Last
wow.
time
when he was
I
Romeo-
saw him at the Green Parrot.
He was
Were you
touring as
there?
Yeah.
Romeo
Oh, those-
Blue, right?
Those were the days.
That was something. Yeah. So, all right. So, let's get back here. We are now 67 still. Of course,
right.
we have to mention Janis Joplin and
Big Brother
Jimi
and
Hendrix, of course. And,
best.
like you said, the
27 Club.
Doors. Right. And at this point, they had one of the first music festivals was Monterey, in
yes.
California. And all these guys came onto the scene. It was a beautiful scene, and everybody loved it, right? So then next year, what happened in 1968? A new form of music was birthed, as I like to say, heavy metal. Now, it's grounds for contention here of who the forefathers of heavy metal are. But in my head, of course, it's Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, which both were recording their albums at this time, their first albums. And, of course, Deep Purple was also in this mix at the same time. And then, of course, in New York, you had the Velvet Underground, which was one of the most influential bands of all time with Lou Reed. Then in Detroit, you know what was going on in Detroit? You had the MC5. You had Iggy and the Stooges. You had Alice Cooper. All this stuff going on at the same time.
Yeah.
So the 60s were a fertile ground for music, to say the least. During this time, basically every city in the country is on fire and producing amazing music. So and that was the beauty of it, too, of AM radio that you mentioned before, that they played all of this stuff. They played, bubblegum music, followed by Jimi Hendrix, followed by Sly and the Family Stone, and all of that stuff. So it was an amazing time.
Wow,
amazing
it must have been
time
a great
for
time
music.
to just live,
Yes, I was in Vietnam during this time.
He was 5 years old, ladies and gentlemen, when Vietnam was.
Yes.
Younger than that.
That just came up. I always make jokes about being in Vietnam, and Mike never
I
actually
thought
knew
he
that.
was. So we're
there.
driving up to see Robbie Krieger last week, and we're in the car, and I said, Dennis, were you really in Vietnam? Tell me about it. I'm sorry, I don't want to really, if it's a touchy subject. And he informed me that he was 5 years old at the time Vietnam was going on. And he was
Over.
not.
Yeah, when it was
The
over.
war was over.
So yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, because the Doors were a huge part of 60s and LA scene and all that stuff. We just went this past weekend to go see Robbie Krieger And like I mentioned, Luther here is the manager, and Mike here is the singer of the Doors tribute band, Light My Fire. And we're all friends with Robbie Krieger and his son Waylon, who's the singer. And we went up and we saw them. We hung out with them backstage. And it was just kind of surreal that, that someone that you looked up to and loved their music so much as a 5-year-old kid, and then growing up still listening to it and never imagining you're ever going to meet them, because by the time I was even aware, the Doors had already broken up and Jim was dead, and I just listened to the albums over and over and over and just loved the Doors so much. And then here I am talking to Robbie Krieger backstage, hanging out with them like he's a normal human being, and he's on the same level as me.
He's the coolest. He's so chill, laid back. But I had the opportunity last year to sing on stage with him because he chose our keyboard player from Let My Fire, Ryan Daly, to play with him for 2 shows last year. So that's how I got to meet the guys. And I really hit it off pretty well with Waylon. And so he was nice enough to set things up, this year. And geez, talking to Waylon, it's just, after listening to the interview and knowing him, he's just, he knows his stuff. He's been around, and he quite a guitar player. An amazing musician. And
dying to hear that guitar playing. Yeah.
There's so much to dive into. With him.
Good stuff. It's just very surreal. So let's get back to this now.
All right.
We're back to 1969 now, the biggest music festival ever in the history of the world. The 60s all come together at this point at Woodstock in upstate New York, the biggest festival. Every person you ever known was there at this concert. Jimmy, Janis, Joe Cocker, Sly and the Family Stone, you name it, they were there. Except the Doors, of course.
That's one of Luther B. Hayes' favorite songs is from Joe Cocker, is Little Help from My Friends.
Luther, right? Help from my friends. Good stuff.
What would you do if I...
Right? See, you have to keep feeding Luther lines. Luther! Come on, Luther. Wake up, Luther.
Luther B. Hayes.
Interject there anytime you want.
I actually was in Woodstock in 1994, the 25th anniversary, and was there Saturday morning, 11 o'clock. Joe Cocker came out, spoke a little bit about what it was like in '69, all the other artists, what it was like backstage, the mayhem and everything. And then he went in and he opened, and he was in full voice, and he had quite a backing group and everything, and he did an amazing rendition of that song, 1994, Saturday morning. I think it was the 13th or so of August.
Did he recreate his whole set, or just
that? I don't even know. You know what? I can't really remember.
Yeah.
But it was a good set. He was up to par, and was definitely a good show. There was a lot of other great bands. Same thing though. You know what? Saturday was great, beautiful day, perfect day. Saturday night, it started to rain, and it was almost 25 years, the recreation. Woke up Sunday, mud people everywhere, naked mud.
Oh, that's right. They were throwing mud, and the Green Day was eating it.
Yeah, they were more. There was a hill in between the 2 stages. They had 2 stages at 94, and in between the hill, the 2 stages, they had this hill, and people were going down the hill, sliding down the hill in the mud, and at the bottom was a big puddle. And once you were committed to being a mud person, you were not getting the mud off. You were stuck. And it was a serious show. There was a lot of great bands. I remember seeing Jason Bonham was there. He was playing with Neil Schon and Paul Rogers. They did like a kind of a little bit of Free and Bad Company and even some Zeppelin tunes. Santana was there. They were great, and of course, the closing night. Oh my God, the Red Hot Chili Peppers came out.
Fire.
The light bulb heads. Just wow,
Was that you that started the fire and burned the place down?
No, not me. No,
Statute of limitations is over. You can admit it now.
No.
Didn't they come out with a sock? Just a sock?
I don't think it was that point then. It was some
Woodstock?
other time. I think it was earlier than that. Yeah.
I think it was. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
All right, so we got to keep this moving. We got a lot of stuff to get to. We got to get to the decline. So now the 60s ended after Woodstock. That was when it all came together. And then a couple months later, or actually at that time, that's when the 60s ended with Charles Manson killing everybody in California. And then, of course, the Rolling Stones tried a free concert in Altamont, and they decided to hire the Hells Angels and give them drugs and beer and see how that turned out. And
my dad was there.
Was he really?
He was at that concert.
Get out.
He left Santa Monica, went up there. He had a bunch of posters. Supposed to sell the posters and make a bunch of dough. Took too many hits of LSD and ended up in Tijuana, flipped over the GTO, and a week later we found him, down in San Diego.
Oh, man. So, I didn't know your dad was a hippie or whatever you want to call him.
Yeah.
So was he a hippie or was he a biker?
Oh, no, he was not a biker. He
Okay.
was just a big hippie back in the day.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
And a year later, Chuck had a new brother named Sancho.
No, that's Mike's brother, Sancho.
All right, so we're going to take another break now. We're going to play some more music. We're going to play, how about we'll play Foxy Lady now and Like a Rolling Stone, and we'll be right back.
Get you. Right, man.
Hey, welcome back live from Dennis's house. That was Foxy Lady by Jimi Hendrix. And what else did I say? Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
Two of the most influential songs of all time. Jimi Hendrix, undeniably the most influential guitar player of all time. Bob Dylan, the greatest lyricist of all time. Yes. And the best vocal, I would have to say, too.
Bob Dylan? Are you kidding me?
Good thing Chacha's not
here.
She would make fun of him.
Freddie Mercury and Bob Dylan. I would go with Freddie.